you may be around the world, and thank you for your company once again on truth2u.org. That's truth, number 2, letter u.org. Joining me is the Director of Education and Counseling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca, jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
I missed you, Jono.
I missed you. Not only did I miss you, but everybody misses you. You know, there are people around the world that have collapsed on the floor, are shaking back and forth in cold sweats, saying, when's the next program coming out? They are, because we left them high and dry in the middle of Daniel. We've been doing Daniel now for, 4 or 5 weeks. This is Daniel chapter 9 that we're in. And we got up to Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, I do believe. We touched briefly on 26, but we're going to get into that further today. Before we do, I think you need to bring everybody back up to speed and do a bit of a recap, because so much has gone on in the book of Daniel since we started looking at this.
Yeah, this is actually, you have to really, I think, spend some serious time trying to work your way through this chapter. So let's try and just briefly summarize what we did previously. We really examined 2 claims on this list of alleged Messianic prophecies from Daniel 9. We've done 2 of them, and basically we found them to have come up short, actually extremely short. So the first was from verse 24, and the claim is that Daniel is told here by the angel, this is the angel Gabriel, that the Messiah would come to make an end to sins, and that Jesus fulfilled this. That's the claim is that Daniel was told the Messiah would come to make an end to sin, and that this is exactly what Jesus did. So first of all, we should just realize that if you read verse 24, it doesn't say that the Messiah would come to make an end to sin. What it says is that 490 years, or 70 weeks of years, have been decreed upon the people of Israel and upon the temple in Jerusalem as a period of time that would have to pass before the Messianic prophecies of restoration and redemption could be fulfilled. And the angel basically describes 6 elements to this restoration. The angel says that these 70 weeks of years, these 490 weeks of years, have been decreed to ultimately lead to the termination of transgression, the end of sin, the wiping away of iniquity, bringing everlasting righteousness, sealing vision and prophet, and the anointing of the Holy of Holies. What's clear is that none of these things was fulfilled or accomplished during the time of Jesus. And it's really the same thing we've seen in several other prophecies that are supposed to happen when the Messiah comes. We have seen other prophecies that when the Messiah comes, there'll be an ingathering of the exiles, the reuniting of the tribes of Israel and the tribes of Judah. There'll be world peace, meaning that none of the things that the Bible says will happen when the Messiah comes happened at the time of Jesus. And of course, that's what sort of forces Christianity to propose the need for a second coming, meaning the whole doctrine of the second coming is just a very it's a clear admission that Jesus didn't fulfill what was supposed to happen in his first coming. So this first prophecy fulfilled on this list from Daniel 9:24 is simply an example of, number one, it's not about the Messiah, and number two, it wasn't fulfilled. So that's important. We'll get back to these 70 weeks a little bit later tonight. The second claim that we looked at was that the angel revealed to Daniel in verse 25 the exact day on which the Messiah would be announced to his people. And the claim is made that it was on this very day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem and was welcomed by the crowds. So in the previous broadcast, what we did was to outline numerous very serious problems with this claim. And we're going to have to be very brief because it would take us 3 weeks to recap everything. So just very briefly, the most serious problem with their reading of verse 25 is that the verse really is misunderstood by them to be speaking about the Messiah. It doesn't really say the Messiah. It speaks about a anointed ruler. So it speaks. They're claiming that it speaks about the Messiah who would come 483 years after a decree regarding the restoration of Jerusalem. So that's how they read verse 25. The error is based upon their error really is based upon a misreading of what the angel actually explained to Daniel. The angel really speaks of an anointed ruler, a Mashiach Nagid, who would come after a period of 7 weeks of years, which is 49 years. So this anointed ruler doesn't come after 483 years. He comes after 49 years. And then the angel says that following this, Jerusalem's going to be built up, but in very troubled times, for a period of 62 weeks of years, which is 434 years. Now, what the Christological misreading of this passage ignores is that there are two separate periods of time. They ignore the fact that there are these two separate periods of time, and what they do, instead of seeing two separate periods of time, a period of the 49 years after which an anointed ruler comes, and then a period of 62 weeks during which the temple is rebuilt, they run these two periods of time together. They ignore the anointed ruler who's going to come after 49 years, totally ignore that one, and they see this as pointing to an anointed one who comes after 483 years. So again, what the passage actually speaks of is an anointed ruler who would come after 49 years, not someone who comes after 483 years. Now, we discussed several reasons why the missionary reading here, the Christological reading, is totally impossible, but we're not going to go into all those reasons here again. Otherwise, this Daniel project might take us 70 weeks of years to accomplish.
So, just to let everybody know, now on truthtoyou.org, if you go there, on the top menu bar, you'll see the heading 365 Messianic Prophecies. If you click on that, it will give you all of the programs that we have done thus far. And we are now, by the way, as we continue to investigate the alleged 365 Messianic prophecies in the Tanakh that Jesus supposedly filled in the New Testament, on the original list, Michael, we're up to number 310 now.
Wow, we're rounding the curve here, rounding the corner.
We sure are. We're getting close.
So again, the problem number one is that the verse 25 is basically butchered by the Christian reading here by ignoring the Messianic ruler who comes after 49 years and making this person come after 483 years. The second major problem with this reading that they have of verse 25 is simply that their calculations don't work out at all, meaning that we'll forget about their claim that this verse nails the exact day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. They don't even get close to the year. The claim that this passage identifies the exact day is just absurd. There's nothing at all that anyone can find in terms of dates in the Bible. So years is the best they can do. And we saw that their calculations don't even get close to the year of Jesus coming into Jerusalem at the end of his life. What they do is they choose an arbitrary starting date for their calculations that we saw was not the actual starting date. We'll get to this in a few minutes. But they get their chance to choose the date that they want to use. But even using their own starting date, which they chose to be 444 before the Common Era, 444 BCE, there the 483rd year comes out to the year 39 CE, which is obviously not close at all to the Passion Week of Jesus. And we discussed in previous episodes the clumsy way that they try to fudge this calculation.
They have to shave off 5 days of each year.
They've got to somehow make up for about 6 years, 6 to 10 years, basically. They have to somehow adjust, make an adjustment. Yeah. Now, that's even given their choice of starting date. Now, we also mentioned that aside from their poor choice of what day to use as the starting date of this chronology of 483 years, we also saw there was a problem with the actual dating system that was used altogether. And that means the following. What they used was a non-Jewish understanding of Jewish history that places the destruction of the first temple in the year 586 before the Common Era. And that would have the decree of Artaxerxes to rebuild the temple at, again, 444 before the Common Era. However, according to Jewish sources, the temple was destroyed in 423 BCE, and Artaxerxes' decree would have been in 335 BCE. In which case, using this dating system, the Jewish dating system, the date that they would have for the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem would be in the year 148 of the Common Era. That's clearly way, way off. But that's a problem, meaning that using the acceptable, standard, historical, traditional Jewish dating system really messes up the calculations that are used here. So they really have two problems. Problem number one is they're using really a non-Jewish dating system, and number two, they're using the incorrect dates. Now, why is it that we can feel more confident with the traditional Jewish dating system? I think I made reference to an article in a book in the previous session that we did, but let me just make one more observation. Aside from the obvious fact that Jews kept meticulous records of their history, and we could probably assume that they have more credibility about their own history than outsiders and non-Jewish sources, but there are actually scriptural indications to verify our version of history. Why is that? Because the secular dating, when you study the way in which secular historians arrived at this 586 BCE date for the destruction of the temple, it's based upon the assumption that there were at least 10 kings that ruled in Persia during the time of their worldwide dominance. They somehow stretched this period of time, assuming that the Persians had 10 kings that ruled over the time where they basically were controlling the world. Jewish sources maintain that there were half that many kings. And you can actually find this in Scripture. You'll go to Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 to 2, and it tells you that there'll be basically 4, maximum 5 kings of Persia who will rule. So you see here, at least in the Bible, some indication that the Jewish method of counting the years is probably more correct than the non-Jewish version, at least if you're concerned about what the scriptures say. Now, to just move on, the timeline that was revealed to Daniel in verse 25, what was that timeline? So we saw that it was a timeline to reassure him about when his people would return to the land of Israel to rebuild the temple. That was basically the context of the chapter, of chapter 9. And we saw that the starting date proposed by the Christological readings, the starting date of 444 BCE, would not have been accessible to Daniel, meaning that Daniel was seeking clarity. The angel came to tell him, I'm going to give you clarity. I'm going to help you understand these sort of mysterious prophecies of Jeremiah that are troubling you and that are confusing you. And the angel said, I'm going to make everything clear to you. I'm going to make you totally understand what is going on in terms of these prophecies that Jeremiah predicted 70 years of Babylon. And so the starting date that Christians use to figure out these 70 weeks of years really is a starting date that Daniel would have no access to, because it starts about 35 years after this encounter with the angel, meaning that this their choice again of the decree of Artaxerxes to restore Jerusalem was in 444 BCE. That was 35 years away, and the problem is that Daniel would have no idea when this decree would even be made, meaning that as far as Daniel was concerned, it could happen in 100 years or 500 years. Daniel doesn't know when this decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem is going to be made. All he's told is that from that decree, you're going to count a certain number of years until an anointed prince is going to come. So the problem is that according to the Christological reading of this passage, they have a starting date for the chronology and the calculations that doesn't do Daniel any good. And he would walk out of his encounter with the angel not having any clarity, not feeling any better about understanding when the Jews are going to go back to Israel, because it could be in centuries. So what we analyzed previously is that when we understand the actual starting date, it has to be from a point in time prior to Daniel's confrontation, his meeting with this angel. Meaning that when the angel gives him a starting date to start counting from, it has to be a starting date that Daniel has access to, which means it had to have been a point in time that happened already. And that Daniel can start counting from that time that he knows about. And we saw that the starting date was from the destruction of the temple. And we saw that in the text itself, in chapter 9, verse 2, and there were other clues that that's the actual starting date. Because since Daniel is praying about when the temple is going to be rebuilt, the starting date is from the time the temple was destroyed. So with this understanding that the chronology that the angel gives begins from the destruction of the temple, we can understand verse 25. The angel says that 49 years after the destruction of the temple, an anointed ruler would appear on the scene. Now we know that this was the Persian king Cyrus, who in the following year, meaning literally in the year following Daniel's encounter with the angel here, meaning that Daniel's wondering, worrying, when are we going to go back? The angel's basically saying, look, it's around the corner. So in the year following this encounter with the angel, Cyrus is going to come to power because the Persians are going to conquer and take over the Babylonian Empire. And when Cyrus comes to power, he's going to allow the Jews to return to their land. And returning to the land is exactly what Daniel was praying about in his very long prayer in Daniel chapter 9. Now this reading, this is very important for people studying the chapter. This reading is confirmed in Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, which speak about Cyrus specifically as being God's anointed one, God's Messiah. And specifically God's Messiah who would send the Jewish people back to their land. And again, there are parallel passages, not just here in Isaiah 44 and 45, but also in Ezra chapter 1 and in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Both talk about the fact that Cyrus would be the one to fulfill Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years of Babylon for the Jews to return to their land. So we really have a very neat and clean understanding of verse 25, and it obviously has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. Now we're going to try and start to move on from verse 25. So basically, chapter 9, verse 25 is speaking about an anointed ruler who would come 49 years after the temple's destruction. And so therefore, it's obviously not speaking about Jesus because, number one, Jesus was never anointed. Number two, Jesus was never a ruler. And number three, Jesus came 400 years after the temple was destroyed, not 49 years later. So for verse 25, we basically can dispense with. Now, the angel came to tell Daniel more than when the people would return to their land to rebuild a temple. That's what Daniel was looking for. Daniel wanted to know, so when are we going back? But in the angel's revelation, he gives Daniel more news, and it's not all good. The angel spoke about a period of 490 years and told Daniel that after going back to Jerusalem, the city would be rebuilt, but it would exist in very difficult times. So it's not going to be a pleasant history after the building of the second temple. And in verse 26, he will tell Daniel that at the end of this period of time, the temple is going to be destroyed and an anointed will be cut off. So the 490 years, when you look at that as a period of time, stretches from the destruction of the first temple. We know that there was 70 years in Babylon as an exile, so there's 70 years, and then the second temple is built, which lasts for 420 years. So the period from the destruction of the first temple until the destruction of the second temple is 490 years, and that's what the angel tells Daniel, that this period of 490 years has been decreed upon the Jewish people and upon the city of Jerusalem as a time during which they might be able to merit the fulfillment of the promises of Messianic redemption that are described in verse 24. That's very important to understand what this period of 490 years is. And what the angel is basically telling Daniel is that the people needed to be purified of their sins during this period of 490 years. And one of the main sins that needed to be rectified was the transgression of not properly observing the sabbatical years. And you can see this partially from the fact that the angel used language that was very reminiscent of the sabbatical years, because he doesn't say that a period of 490 years has been decreed upon your people and city. But
he's talking in sevens.
Right. He says 70 Sabbaths or 77s. So that alludes to this institution of the sabbatical year. And the Bible tells us in Leviticus that if we don't observe the sabbatical years properly, the land itself will have to be recompensed, to have to be paid back for this transgression. So what the angel says, and this is very critical for understanding the entire chapter of Daniel 9, is that this period of 490 years is going to be a very difficult time of suffering for the purpose of purging the sins of the people. And that if they could use this time correctly and purify themselves, all the promises of verse 24 could take place at the end of these 490 years. So what emerges, and this is a subtle point, is that the Messianic age can begin right after the Second Temple is destroyed, because the 490 years ends with that event. And what the angel tells Daniel is that God is decreeing a period of 490 years upon your people in order to be able to accomplish these incredible things, the ending of sin and ultimate righteousness and anointing the Holy of Holies. All that can happen as soon as the Second Temple is destroyed, if, that's the big caveat, if the people actually purify themselves during this period of time. Now, this directly contradicts one of the major claims that Christians make, which is they constantly claim that the Messiah has to come before the destruction of the Second Temple. In point of fact, it's only after the destruction that the possibility of the Messiah coming is possible. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that the rabbis teach that the Messiah is born on the day that the temple was destroyed, meaning that the possibility of the Messiah coming begins with the destruction of the temple. And of course, if the Jewish people don't actualize the potential of those 490 years, the arrival of the Messiah can be postponed until they do get their act together. Now, just one little PS before we go on. The angel says that this period of 70 weeks of years is decreed upon your people and the temple. Now, the Christian reading of Daniel 9 basically takes it completely out of this context, meaning in the way Christians understand these 490 years, it really has very little to do with the Jewish people specifically and the temple specifically. For them, it's really speaking about, almost in replacement theology terms, a whole different ballgame. In the scheme of things, the Jewish people in the Christian scheme of things have either been replaced by the church completely, or we really don't have all that much of a place in the history of the world anymore. This prophecy in Daniel was directed exclusively to the people of Israel and their temple. And it doesn't really have to do that much with the temple at all in Christian terms, again, unless you take their interpretation that Jesus replaces the temple. But there's nothing in Daniel which really hints at the fact that, some person's going to replace the temple. So what I wanted to start now was looking at the next two claims that are made on this list that we're analyzing. There really should be one claim, because one speaks about
it's
the
a bit of double up, isn't it? Yeah.
I think it's like a hiccup here. One says the Messiah is to be killed, and one says the Messiah is to be killed before the destruction of the temple. So let's roll those into one and say that the next prediction, they're counting it as two, is that based upon verse 26 in Daniel chapter 9, the Messiah is to be killed before the destruction of the temple. Okay.
And that's meant to be a Messianic prophecy fulfilled. Now, it's interesting, while you were just talking, I'm looking at the study notes in my Christian translation, the New King James Nelson Study Bible, and on verse 26 it says, Messiah shall be cut off, may. Now, this is an interesting choice of words. Maybe a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The phrase cut off means to destroy or to kill. The fact that Jesus Christ died not for himself, but for the sins of the world may support the view that the Messiah in this verse refers to Jesus himself. Interesting that their study notes they don't seem entirely convinced.
Yeah, they're hedging their bets here.
Yeah, it's interesting.
They're a little bit less certain than the list that we're analyzing.
That's right.
I'd be curious as to why they are sort of reticent to come out and make a full statement here. But it's interesting. I think that it's interesting. And it's interesting because, again, one of the things that we discussed previously was that if this really was a messianic prophecy, you would have expected it to be in the New Testament. So maybe that's why they're balking, because there's no support for this claim. But it's interesting. I'm impressed by their honesty there. Okay, so we're going to try and get into verse 26 now, but as I mentioned before, it's going to be important for us to point out that the Christian reading of the whole passage here engages in a bit of misdirection. If you ever see magicians, they'll misdirect your attention so that you don't notice really what's going on.
A bit of trickery in the text.
Well, there's a little bit of misdirection here. I'll try to explain why. Mm-hmm. Basically, what's happening here in the Christian reading of these passages is that they're looking at a timeline of 69 weeks of years, or 483 years. That's really what they're looking at. Mm-hmm. Meaning that they count from their own chosen but very incorrect starting date, and from that date they count 483 years, and they try to arrive at the Passion Week. This is the year that Jesus allegedly comes into Jerusalem, and the year in which he's killed. Mm-hmm. So that's really what they've been looking at. Their calculations have been basically, basically focusing on a period of 483 years. However, the angel that first comes to Daniel doesn't say that a period of 69 weeks of years has been decreed. The angel speaks about a period of 70 weeks of years. So the important question is, what happens to the 70th week in the Christian reading of Daniel? Where is the 70th week? So there are basically two ways in which Christians understand the 70th week, or the last 7 years of the period of 490 years. And both of the views have it disconnected from the other 69 weeks of years. What we're going to see is that from the Christian readings of Daniel, the 490 years are not contiguous. They're broken up. The first view I'm going to mention is, I think, a view that is held by a minority. I don't think that many evangelicals have this perspective, but I think a minority of evangelicals would say that the 70th week was fulfilled with destruction of the Second Temple. And the problem here is that the destruction of the Second Temple took place 40 years after Jesus was crucified. Now, verse 26 very clearly says that an anointed will be cut off at the same time that the temple will be destroyed. It doesn't speak about a gap between the cutting off of the anointed and the destruction of the temple. They happen really at the same time. Mm-hmm. Now, Jesus was killed 5.5 weeks of years, meaning 35 years approximately, or 40 years actually. 40 years would be about 5.5 weeks of years before the destruction of the temple. Mm-hmm. And what the verse doesn't say, what it should have said from a Christian reading, at least according to this first Christian reading, is that an anointed one will be cut off, and that 5.5 weeks later, the temple would be destroyed. So here you have a problem just in terms of how to understand this period of 490 years. What some Christians do is to read the ending of this 490 years with the destruction of the temple, but then they have a problem with the way they read verse 26, because there's a gap of 40 years that are not accounted for. Now, I think that this is not the way most Christians understand the 70th week. My reading of Christian commentaries seems to show that most evangelicals see the 70th week being fulfilled just prior to the second coming of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Now, here, there's a gap of about 2,000 years and possibly much more between the 69th week and the 70th week. Now, of course, the text in Daniel doesn't present the 70th week as separated from the other 69 weeks by either 40 years or 2,000 years. So in these Christian readings, both of these Christian readings, the original statement of the angel that a period of 490 years being decreed is really meaningless. Let me share with you and with the listeners an analogy that I saw from Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Blumenthal. He says the angel's declaration about 490 years is like someone telling their friend that it's 50 miles from New York to Los Angeles. When the friend says that that's ridiculous, he's told, well, I'm sure you realize that there's a huge gap between the 49th and the 50th mile. So when you say that, the original statement is meaningless. That to say that there's 50 miles between New York and Los Angeles is really meaningless when that's not really what's meant. And so the Christian readings have a tough time with the angel's pronouncement that a period of 490 contiguous years have been decreed upon the Jewish people and upon the temple. Now, I want to point out a few more problems with the Christian reading of verse 26 before we try to understand what it says. It speaks about an anointed one, an anointed, being cut off. The Hebrew word is yikaret. It's an unusual term because it doesn't use here one of the normal words in Hebrew for being killed, or being slain. I mean, you have many words in Hebrew that could have been used for someone that's killed. But here it uses the word karet, yikaret. And in the Tanakh, this term karet is used exclusively for the demise of wicked people, for people who commit the most serious and heinous transgressions. So one thing we know about the anointed one who's cut off in verse 26 is that he's certainly not a righteous person. That might present some difficulties for Christians who insist that it's Jesus being the one cut off in verse 26. Another problem with the Christian reading of verse 26 is that most Christian translations, the ones that I've consulted, I think that you just read it in your New King James, renders Yikaret Mashiach ve'ein lo as the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. That's how they read these words, ve'ein lo, and not for himself. And this translation really comes to support the Christological idea that Jesus didn't die for himself, but he died as a vicarious sacrifice for others. Meaning that by saying, and he was cut off, but not for himself, the implication is, but he was cut off for others. The problem is, ve'ein lo does not mean not for himself. Ve'ein lo, there are a couple of ways it could be rendered. One would be that he'll have nothing. He'll be cut off
and have not, right?
Have nothing. Or you could read it as saying he'll be cut off and will be no more, or he'll exist no longer. Ve'ein lo, he won't be. But there's no way of reading this phrase as not for himself. It's just really it's a twisting of the Hebrew in order to really allow for a Christological understanding of what happens to this anointed one. So who is the anointed one that is cut off in verse 26? So there are actually several possibilities. Rashi and others will insist that the one that's cut off here is Agrippa, who was the last Jewish king that was reigning before the temple was destroyed. He is and we know that Jewish kings are anointed, or they're called anointed ones. And in this verse, so we know that after the demise of Agrippa, the prince who is described in this verse as coming is basically the Roman Titus, who would then destroy the temple. So the anointed one here is cut off, and just at the same period of time, the temple is destroyed. Another way of reading this passage is that, and by the way, it could theoretically refer to both, but another way of reading it is that the anointed that's cut off is the high priest who was serving before the temple was destroyed. We know, by the way, that the high priests at that time were mostly Sadducees, and they were certainly wicked. It was usually a bribed, that was the Romans were bribed in order for someone to achieve the office of high priest So the last
They were certainly not of the correct lineage in order to hold the office. Is that fair to say?
they may have been actually from the priestly line. I don't know that they weren't actually priests, but
No, they would have been priests, but we understand that a high priest must be, of course, not just from Aaron, not just from Eleazar, not just from Pinchas, but through Zadok and these ones leading into this era, I don't believe were, if I remember correctly.
I don't know. But what was important is that even if they were from the correct line, let's say they were, but they were not people that were deserving of this office. They were not righteous people. They were, from a Jewish point of view, heretics, and there certainly were people who basically achieved their office through bribery in many cases. And so the Bible uses the word here of karet, to be cut off. These are not noble people. And it could be referring, by the way, not just to the high priest that's cut off, because that's one way of reading it, is that it could be talking about the high priest who was cut off and then the temple destroyed. And of course, by the way, it doesn't have to be the killing of the high priest. It could simply mean that he's cut off from his job because the temple is destroyed, and then he'll have nothing, meaning that the Ein Lo would mean that he has nothing. Once the temple is destroyed, these corrupt priests have absolutely nothing. They're out of a job. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the high priest here is killed. It could. It could simply mean that the high priest is cut off from his service because the temple is going to be destroyed. And by the way, the phrase "the anointed will be cut off" could refer to the entire priesthood that's cut off from the service in the temple when the temple is destroyed. So it's not 100% clear exactly who this is referring to. But that's basically the way verse 26 is understood. And I hope that, with this, I guess, brief study of Daniel chapter 9, we've come to understand some of the major problems with this list that we've been analyzing in their claims that Jesus fulfilled all of these prophecies.
And the people of the prince who is to come, you're saying, is potentially Titus.
Well, and his armies, basically.
And his armies that came and destroyed the temple and pillaged all the furnishings and so on and so forth.
It was actually, first it was Vespasian who began the siege of Jerusalem. And then we know that Vespasian was brought back to Rome to be the emperor. And so Vespasian, I think it was his son Titus, that took over and ended up really concluding the siege by destroying the temple.
So the second half of verse 26 is really just talking about that. It says, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. It's interesting, actually, that line, the end of it shall be with a flood. And I think of the Ark of Titus. And I think of the way it is depicted, that it's almost like a flood of I know it's a flood of violence, but it's a flood of soldiers seem to have taken everything. They've destroyed the temple. Now there is, because you see them carrying away the menorah in the frieze of the Ark of Titus, and it's like a wave of people that are now leaving with after pillaging it.
Not just a wave of people leaving, by the way, but we know that the Romans were very, very ticked off with the Jewish people. I mean, they really, the Romans were basically able to exert their control over their entire empire fairly easily. People didn't mess with the Romans. And, the Jews kept on revolting. In the year 66, the Jews launched this revolt against the Romans. And, who else did that? What other people would have the audacity and the chutzpah, to revolt against this superpower? This incredible superpower. And so, the Romans never really took challenges to their domination lightly. And so they sent in a serious army to do the job here. And then we know that, there was a second revolt, I think around the year 116. They revolted. And then in 132, I think, you had the final revolt by Bar Kokhba. And that was really the end of it. And, 135, that was the final destruction of everything. And we were we lost our independence up until the year 1948. So the Romans, they wanted to make sure they got the job done. So when Titus came, he came with a very serious force, and they were brutal. They really were brutal. I mean, some estimates are that they might have, in the destruction of Jerusalem, some estimates are they killed about half of the Jewish people living in the land of Israel. Some estimates were there were about 2 million people living in Israel. They may have murdered up to about 1 million.
Wow.
So it was really, it was.
So the streets ran with blood.
It was horrible.
And, it says, and until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Is that just a way of saying, and it doesn't just stop with the temple, there are ongoing desolations that will occur in this period of time? Is that basically what that is?
I think it's a possible reading. You know, some of the language here is obviously, open for interpretation. It's not an exact science in terms of how to read all these phrases, but I think that what it's trying to depict is, basically an obliteration of this city, a destruction of the temple, a violent destruction of the temple in the city, and that's really what happens. And the important thing to notice is that what it's very clearly saying is that this anointed one will be cut off and the city will be destroyed. They're basically said in the same breath. It doesn't say that there will be a gap of 40 years between the cutting off of this anointed one and the destruction of the city. Daniel was given a very precise timeline. If you go to the next verse, it speaks about 3.5 years. So if there really was going to be a gap between the cutting off of the anointed and the destruction of the temple, it would have said, and the anointed will be cut off, and then after 5.5 or 5 weeks of years, the temple will be destroyed. These two events are basically simultaneous, and so for many reasons. And again, you have to remember that the Christological reading of these verses sees the one that's cut off, the anointed one that's cut off in verse 26, as the very same person that's described, the anointed ruler who comes in verse 25. There are many reasons why we know that that's impossible. First of all, we know that the anointed ruler of verse 25 comes about 400 years before the anointed one that's cut off in verse 26. And secondly, Daniel himself describes them differently. The anointed one in verse 25 is an anointed ruler, and the anointed in verse 26 is just an anointed. Now, that is what leads me to think that it may be referring not so much to Agrippa, who was basically the king of Israel at that time, not a full king, but more referring to the high priest, because the high priest is not a ruler. And I think that what Daniel does is distinguish between the anointed ruler of verse 25 and just an anointed in verse 26, which would not be a ruler. And that would be with the high priest.
That makes a lot of sense. No, thank you for clarifying that. So that's verse 26. How about that? That takes us on the original list, takes us up to number 113. There's one more for the book of Daniel, but we're going to leave that to next week. In fact, we're going to get through a whole lot in what is often referred to as the minor prophets. The smaller prophets, we're going to get through those next week, but there we are. I think we've addressed at least Daniel 9, chapter 9, verse 24, 25, 26, as is highlighted on the list. Thank you, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
Thank you, and it's been such a great time being with you again, and we look forward to being here next week.
Always wonderful to have you. I can't wait. Again, Rabbi Skobac of JewsForJudaism.ca, Jews for Judaism in Canada. Go there. There's so much more. If you like this, oh my goodness, friends, there's so much more on that website, and of course the YouTube channel as well. Once again, on the menu, the top menu bar of truth2you.org, you'll see 365 Messianic Prophecies. Click on that, and it will offer all the programs that we have done thus far if you have missed any of them. And we're going to be getting into it again next week. So in the meantime, dear listeners, be blessed to be set apart by the truth of our Father's Word. Shalom.